Our next presenter is a PhD candidate from Queensland University of Technology. Nancy Grevis-James is going to share the perspectives of NGOs in relation to people with disability in their contact with the police. So thanks a lot, Nancy.
Good afternoon, everyone. The current research indicates that individuals with intellectual disabilities are overrepresented at all stages of the criminal justice system. At the front end of the criminal justice system, frontline police often come into contact with individuals with intellectual disabilities. However, the research on this interaction is limited in the field, particularly in Queensland. In my talk today, I'll be reporting on the interactions between frontline police and individuals with intellectual disabilities from the perspective of NGOs. My presentation will cover two broad areas. Firstly, the circumstances and experiences that are likely to bring individuals with intellectual disabilities into contact with police. In this section, I'll talk broadly about some of the findings from my research, which indicate that individuals with intellectual disabilities are likely to come into contact with frontline police due to disadvantaged circumstances and experiences. In the second part of the presentation, I'll talk about some of the criminal justice experiences of individuals with intellectual disabilities when they come into contact with police according to NGOs. In this part of the talk, I'll be focusing on some of the key barriers identified by NGOs that can impact on how police interact with individuals with intellectual disabilities, and how these barriers can result in negative criminal justice experiences or outcomes for this group. In this section, I'll also briefly provide suggestions made by NGOs on how these barriers can be addressed. At this stage, I'd like to point out that overall, NGOs in this study viewed the interactions between police and individuals with intellectual disabilities as generally positive and in some instances negative. In talking about these more negative experiences today, I hope to touch on some of the complexities around the interaction between police and individuals with intellectual disability. But before I go on, I'll just provide a very brief background of the research. So the central aim of the study was to explore the criminal justice experiences of individuals with intellectual disabilities who engage with frontline police from the perspective of NGOs. Data was collected through a process of in-depth interviews with staff from NGOs across Queensland. 16 participants in total from 4 different NGOs took part in the study. The 16 participants who did take part in the study held varying positions, from managers and supervisors to social workers. The experiences amongst this group varied from 35 years in the human sector to just over 1 year. In my presentation today, I'll draw on some of the key themes that have emerged from the interview data, and excerpts from the data will be used throughout my talk to illustrate key points. To protect the identity of participants, pseudonyms have been used. In conversations with NGOs, many of the individuals they support with intellectual disabilities have experienced disadvantage, and it is often the case that an individual's marginalisation can bring them into contact with the criminal justice system. For instance, according to non-government organisations, historical and environmental disadvantage can bring individuals with intellectual disabilities into contact with police. Stephen states, if people come from severely socially disadvantaged and poverty backgrounds, homeless, etc., things like that, they're more likely to have contact with the police. Jane adds, all those socio-economic backgrounds, homelessness, quite a large number of homelessness, or living in short-term crisis accommodation at the time they've come into contact with police. NGOs also indicated that how individuals with intellectual disabilities manage their disadvantaged circumstances, or more to the point, their inability to manage these circumstances, can bring them to the attention of frontline police. For instance, NGOs talked about individuals amongst this group abusing substances to cope with historical traumas and breakdown of relationships. NGOs also talked about individuals with intellectual disabilities developing antisocial behaviour as an outcome of their disadvantaged circumstances, which also puts them at risk. This is shared in the following discussion amongst Jane and Serena. Relationship breakdown seems to be more of a common one, which has impacted on other aspects of their life. Homelessness, so if they've either been evicted from their homes or moving around quite frequently, so going between short-term accommodation to, say, living with family and friends, also seems to impact on their situation, which may then lead to excessive drinking or taking drugs. Yeah, it puts them at risk and they're quite vulnerable as well. Serena states, with a history of trauma, their anxiety is heightened. Their ability to be living a healthy and eating healthy and getting adequate rest is jeopardised as well, and therefore potentially their medication compliance. So therefore the behaviours become more erratic, and as a result there's more likely to be negative interaction with people around them, or they're placed in situations or circumstances where there are other people around them who are also traumatised, and where you can have behaviours that may be antisocial and so forth, and that results in aggression, fear, potential for abuse and assault. A lack of support networks and isolation was also identified by NGOs as risk factors for individuals with intellectual disabilities coming into contact with police. You'll have those situations where people are very lonely. They'll go online and look to meet up with boyfriends, look for partners. That's a situation where we've supported women, particularly that have made connections with people that are possible exploiters, that we will support them to go off and talk to the police and to consider ways to protect themselves. NGOs also indicated that the community can be a key source of vulnerable experiences for individuals with intellectual disabilities. In some cases, individuals with intellectual disabilities are made vulnerable because of their limited capacity to navigate normative boundaries and interactions with other members of the community, or because of their perceived limited capacity, other members of the community take advantage of this group. In conversations with non-government organisations, these forms of vulnerability were described as causing individuals with intellectual disabilities to be exploited, targeted, coerced and taken advantage of. People come across the dark side of the community when people don't have a meaningful role, don't, for example, work or whatever it is. They don't have supportive, a strong, rich family life. So they come from backgrounds of family poverty, then they're much more likely to be in a community where there is greater social and economic disadvantage, likely to be around at times when there's other people also from backgrounds of difficulty, more likely to stay in public housing or social housing. And then the unfortunate reality is that there is also other people around in those communities who get to know the people we work with, and they are seen as easy targets, I think. Often, they'll get involved with somebody they met on the train or at the shopping centre who realises that that person has an intellectual disability, and that person will take advantage of that. So often guys will be introduced and encouraged to smoke drug, marijuana, sniff glue. I have a number of clients who know a lot of the guys who hang around the city here in Brisbane, and those guys are substance abusers, steal stuff and all the rest of it. Now the clients that I have don't really have the capacity to differentiate between when you should do something to get a mate, and that's what mates do, and that's what a friend would do, and not. A lot of times they're in trouble with the police because they really couldn't make that distinction. These findings show that individuals with intellectual disabilities are made vulnerable through disadvantaged circumstances, as well as developing at times ineffective coping mechanisms, such as the abuse of alcohol and drugs to manage these circumstances, and also through negative community associations, where they are targeted or exploited by others. These are some of the experiences which can place people with intellectual disabilities at a greater risk of coming into contact with police. When individuals with intellectual disabilities do come into contact with police, a key argument made throughout the literature in this field and amongst NGOs in this study is that police ought to have a duty to respond appropriately. Part of an appropriate police response is the recognition of diversity in the community and greater awareness of the rights of individuals. Stenning and Sharing state, acceptable policing is not just policing that efficiently and effectively polices a prescribed order, but policing that conforms with internally accepted norms of civility, dignity, and human rights. For individuals with intellectual disabilities, an appropriate police response is one that recognises their vulnerability and rights to access the criminal justice system. However, The data shows that the ability of frontline police to respond appropriately to the vulnerabilities of individuals with intellectual disabilities is made complex by a number of barriers. I'll talk just about some of these barriers today. As the first line of response in the criminal justice system, police play a significant role in the criminal justice experiences of individuals with intellectual disabilities. According to Spivak and Thomas, police are faced with the difficult task of acting not only as law enforcement agents, but also as mental health referral agents, having to make the fundamental decision as to whether a person's presentation, behaviour and circumstances may warrant entry into the criminal justice system, diversion into the health system, or perhaps no intervention at all. This suggests that police ought to be able to undertake multifaceted roles when indicating with vulnerable members of the community. However, one of the key issues that NGOs in this study identified was the difficulty police have in even being able to identify whether or not an individual has an intellectual disability. For instance, one participant states, police may not perceive that a person has an intellectual disability, they may perceive other things. It is suggested by NGOs in this study and elsewhere in the literature that police will at times rely on visual cues to determine whether or not an individual has an intellectual disability. Aside from the fact that an individual's disability is not always clearly visible, the use of adaptive skills by individuals with intellectual disabilities makes the ability to identify members of this group much more complex. For instance, NGOs talk about compounding factors, such as masking behaviours, where an individual conceals their disability, which makes it at times impossible for police to identify if an individual has an intellectual disability. Penny states, particularly when you're talking about mild or borderline intellectual disability, their incredible skills of adaptive behaviours, of masking the fact that they have an intellectual disability, would make it really difficult for them to interact and for the police to respond knowing that they have an intellectual disability. Acquiescence was also identified by NGOs as the tendency of individuals with intellectual disabilities to accept or agree to information they may not understand or which may not accurately portray the truth. Kira states, people appear very capable, and when you talk to them, they look very confident and they look like, yes, I understand what you say, and people would just take it at face value. So if they say yes, that means I can go ahead. You ask them later, they don't remember and they don't understand. One of the implications for police not identifying if an individual has an intellectual disability, whether that is due to masking behaviours or the disability itself not being made identifiable by police, is that the behaviour of the individual with intellectual disabilities can be misinterpreted. For instance, one participant states, their behaviours and actions are often misunderstood. I'm walking around here because I have nothing to do and I sort of need to expend some energy. I'm bored, I'm lonely, or I'm lost. Can be seen as, what are you doing here? A lot of our people have physical disability as well, like cerebral palsy, which can be misunderstood as drunkenness quite often. Slurred speech or inability to communicate can be seen as on drugs or drunk, including the inability to understand can be misinterpreted. Here and in other areas of the data, the inability to identify intellectual disability can lead to police misunderstanding or misinterpreting the behaviours of individuals with intellectual disabilities as being under the influence, non-compliant or criminal, for instance. A further implication here is that an individual with intellectual disabilities is likely to proceed further into the criminal justice system with their disability going undetected. This can mean that individuals whose disabilities are not identified when entering the criminal justice system are made visible, for example, as an offender only, rather than an offender with an intellectual disability. The consequence of this being that the individual is unlikely to receive support services and, if incarcerated, are vulnerable to the victimisation of other inmates, amongst other things. Some aspects of the policing process can at times be a barrier for individuals with intellectual disabilities. Indeed, an overall theme in this study was the inconsistency of policing interactions. In a 2012 study by Henshaw and Thomas involving 229 Victorian police officers, it was found that whilst many police officers considered themselves capable in their interactions with individuals with intellectual disabilities, those who identified that they were most in need of training reported lower confidence in how they responded in these encounters. Extending upon this point, the NGOs I talked to stated that frontline police are not always equipped with the knowledge, training or awareness of intellectual disabilities. Indeed, the findings from this study indicates that at times police are even reluctant to engage with individuals with intellectual disabilities because they lack the skills to do this. Price states, the general policeman who comes off the street, they're confronted by somebody who has limited communication skills. They really don't know how to manage that. In this study, NGOs also talked about frontline police as at sometimes resistant to following up on complaints made by individuals with intellectual disabilities. The majority or the general population of Queensland Police seem to see people with a disability as a child or not a credible witness, making up stories. To me, they seem to jump straight to the final outcome, which is this won't go anywhere, there's no point pursuing it, so the person doesn't get any natural justice. On the other hand, participants also noted when police interacted well with individuals with intellectual disabilities to ensure a positive outcome where the individual's rights were protected. In these circumstances, communication emerged as a key theme. This included police checking capacity, continuously ensuring the individuals with intellectual disabilities had an understanding of policing procedures as well as their rights. For example, Kirsty states, the majority or the general population of Queensland Police seem to see people with, in those particular examples that I can think, they take a lot of time to explain the process, a lot of extra time to explain the options, to taking more time to understand what the person was saying, and then involving a support person, letting me try to help her tell her story, and just to say, look, this is what she's told me before, and being able to communicate. These examples suggest that the criminal justice rights of individuals with intellectual disabilities are inconsistently implemented within policing processes. In some parts, police are limited by a lack of training and knowledge about intellectual disabilities, which then impacts on their ability to respond appropriately to situations involving individuals with intellectual disabilities. However, NGOs also suggest that at other times, police officers rely on their discretion when managing individuals with intellectual disabilities rather than being guided by policies and procedures that should allow individuals with intellectual disabilities to have absolute access to their criminal justice rights. Initial findings from the data indicate that police perceptions about capacity can and has led to encounters where the human rights of individuals with intellectual disabilities have not been protected. Police interviews are an example of the context in which this is likely to occur. Henshaw and Thomas state about the use of appropriate adults or guardians in police interviews. A number of jurisdictions have introduced safeguards for interviewees, but their utilisation depends on the police's ability to recognise those in need of these additional supports. In his report on disabled justice, French states that police may inadvertently or intentionally proceed to interview a suspect without having effectively advised the suspect of his or her rights to silence and legal representation. In my study, NGOs indicate that police at times overestimate the capacity of individuals with intellectual disabilities. This is demonstrated in the following case studies from the data. In one case study, a participant gave an example of an individual with significant intellectual disabilities who was interviewed by police for an extended period of time. The participant described this person as having an obvious disability. She states, we had a client with a significant intellectual disability who was interviewed for 5 hours by the police without a guardian or person present. The participant stated that as soon as she was informed by the client of what had happened, she contacted the police station immediately. I got on to the police and said, what are you doing? How can this happen? How did this happen? I questioned why that interview had occurred without any support person or guardian or any consideration for the client's intellectual disability. They just said, they asked him if he was willing to participate in the interview, and he said yes. I said, he very obviously has an intellectual disability, so how did you determine his capacity? And they couldn't answer me. In another case study, I remember one time the person got in trouble with the police. So he got taken to the police beat, and the police, they were about to start the interview, and the person got really scared. He called the on-call number because we only work 9 to 5, so it was after 5 o'clock. I spoke to the policeman saying, I'm happy to support the person, to come to talk to you, but can we make it tomorrow? I was really advocating for that, and he was saying, well, he looks fine, so he can do it tonight. In other interviews, NGOs talked about the issue of police underestimating an individual's capacity. In general terms, the majority of police come across people with intellectual disability the majority of the time, which is generally on the street or in day-to-day responses. It's a bit of a, oh well, why bother, they can't give me what I want. This finding demonstrates that in some cases, capacity, whether it is overestimated or underestimated, can be overlooked, and the rights of individuals with intellectual disabilities to access guardians not enacted by police. The implication of this for individuals with intellectual disabilities is that as vulnerable adults, the protection of rights and welfare that guardians would ideally offer during police interviews is taken away and places this group in a more vulnerable position. The interaction between police and NGOs can also have an impact on the criminal justice experiences of individuals with intellectual disabilities. A key factor that can impact on the ability for police to effectively manage a situation involving an individual with intellectual disabilities is the resistance police have at times to the role of non-government organisations. For instance, one participant talks about the tension she experiences when coming into contact with police in her role as a social worker. She states, "You may come across where some policemen they're not acknowledging what is your role and why you're here, even though you are trying to make it as simple as possible and really advocate the reason you have to be there." The issue here is that in some instances, such as the one Kira talked about, NGOs are not being effectively utilised as a possible support mechanism that may help to manage situations between police and individuals with intellectual disabilities. One of the implications here is the possibility of situations between police and individuals with intellectual disabilities escalating. As one participant states, sometimes where the police don't have the skills to actually diffuse the matter, it can escalate. And Eddie gives an example. I have seen quite a number of situations get out of hand where, because the lack of understanding of the police's part, things escalated way beyond what was really necessary. So the end result, perhaps, if that person had have been given a little bit of time and space, there would be no problem. Because police get quite frightened too, very frightened. Sometimes it's due to a lack of understanding. If somebody's got fractured thoughts, is weaving all over the place and hasn't got a weapon or anything, but is unpredictable, police are very wary of you because they're not really sure what you are going to do and they don't understand. They've got no real experience other than when they're called and when something is going wrong. So they just want you to do when they want you to do it because they don't really know what's happening. They get a bit frightened. So usually that results in, let's all jump on him and put him in handcuffs. That way, at least we'll know he's not going to do anything because he won't be able to do anything. The impact this, of course, has on individuals with intellectual disabilities is that it further widens a gap between the rights of individuals with intellectual disabilities and their ability to have access to it. So far I've presented just a very broad introduction to some of the barriers that impact on how police interact with individuals with intellectual disabilities. This has included difficulties police have in identifying intellectual disabilities, misconceptions about intellectual disabilities, and resistance to non-government organisations when managing situations involving individuals from this community. Now I'd like to briefly touch on just some of the suggestions and current strategies NGOs identified as addressing the barriers discussed in this presentation. Firstly, on issues of police identification of intellectual disabilities, the literature talks about early identification as essential in protecting the rights of individuals with intellectual disabilities. In this study, NGOs suggested simple questions police could ask if they encounter an individual who they even just suspects to have an intellectual disability. For example, one participant states, there are simple things that they could do, basic questions they could ask that aren't obvious questions, and it's just getting a picture of a person. Are they on a pension, or why are they on a pension? Do you go to school? When did you finish school? Write this down for me, add up some numbers. It's clear from the perspective of non-government organisations that policing approaches in Queensland could be more effective when encountering individuals in the community who may have an intellectual disability. The simple strategy suggested by NGOs is one that could be easily adopted into policing practices. NGOs recognise that these simple questions aren't a proper assessment, but they can give some indication, particularly if there are other signals, such as someone having difficulty communicating in a sequential way, that an individual may have an intellectual disability. On the issue of police perceptions about capacity, NGOs talked about wanting police to have more of an understanding of intellectual disabilities when they come into contact with individuals from this community. Some of the concerns and suggestions made by NGOs were around police training and knowledge of ID. For instance, one participant states, on one side, police need more information about people with disability. I think there is confusion. I think there is not enough training. As part of its Disability Service Plan for 2011 to 2014, Queensland Police Service has made a commitment to increase supports for people with an intellectual disability who are in or at risk of entering and on leaving the criminal justice system by delivering and evaluating training programs for police officers. This supports the on-ground experience of NGOs, which indicate that more awareness of intellectual disabilities and its complexities is needed within the Queensland Police Service. Indeed, the inconsistent use of guardians during police interviews with individuals with intellectual disabilities and the at times inability to effectively manage situations involving individuals with intellectual disabilities demonstrates that further training and knowledge is needed in order for police to become more effective in their role as safeguards for the human rights of individuals with intellectual disabilities. Finally, NGOs talked about developing informal partnerships with police in their local community. This strategy has allowed NGOs and police to work together to better manage individuals with intellectual disabilities who may be at risk of coming into contact with police. Judy states, I went in there with this guy one day and he liked the police. He was going to go and see them if something happened, which he did every couple of days. It was fine. They would call me and say, yes, he's here, he's scared, can you come down? I'll go down and take him home, but that was a case where he was significantly unwell and had PTSD and all that kind of stuff. So it was really important that he had someone he could go to when he was out in public and he started to think like that. But he needed to be able to get around the community by himself because we didn't have the resources to be with him all the time. So rather than him spending 3 hours at the police station, they just rang us. He would go in there for a 10-minute chat, they'd give him a cuppa, and then I'd come and get him. In this study, NGOs talked about these informal partnerships as being very valuable and having many benefits. For instance, NGOs found that these type of informal partner relationships allow police to become familiar with vulnerable members in the local community and to direct them to the appropriate services, as shown in the story shared by Judy. The data also demonstrates that developing a relationship between NGOs and police can be useful in developing rapport between the two organisations, which may help to break down some of the barriers and misconceptions between the two, which can result in better management of situations where individuals with intellectual disabilities come into contact with police. To conclude, this presentation has identified some of the circumstances under which individuals with intellectual disabilities can come to the attention of frontline police, barriers that can have an influence on the criminal justice experiences or outcomes of individuals with intellectual disabilities when they come into contact with police, and suggested solutions to these barriers. To summarise the findings from this study, for the most part, it appeared that participants viewed the interactions between police and individuals with intellectual disabilities as generally positive and on occasion negative. In the case of negative interactions, it is suggested that further training and knowledge is needed to improve police interaction, as well as the continued development of interagency collaborations. Thank you.
Any questions?
I just wondered, was there any comment about third parties other than NGOs in terms of police interviews and like a family member or whatever, and what was the comments?
It was mostly NGOs because my questions were directed to them, so they were talking from their experiences and how they were involved, like preventing police contact or being there to help when police contact had occurred.
Okay, so they didn't mention any family members?
It was mostly NGOs, and they talked about people with ID not really having support or family members around them, so coming from institutional-based care, and so they really were the support network for people with intellectual disabilities, so they really were there with them through the policing process.
Thanks. Anyone else?